Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. This is the second video in the Shining series. In my last video, I talked about King's 1977 novel, as well as before the play and after the play, the original prologue and epilogue from the novel. And in this video, we will discuss Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film adaptation, as well as the 2012 documentary, I'll use that term loosely, of Kubrick's film entitled Room 237, which is essentially what would happen if QAnon shifted their focus to film instead of a cabal of child-murdering globalists. This series will also feature videos for the 2003 three-part miniseries which King himself wrote the teleplay for, the 2013 King novel and sequel to The Shining, Dr. Sleep, the 2012 and 2013 musical parodies, yes, there are two of them, actually there's three, as well as a 2016 musical, that would be the third one, and the 2016 opera adaptation, which is objectively too many musical theater adaptations. And finally, a video for the 2019 movie adaptation of Dr. Sleep. Holy smokes, that's a lot of content. I've hidden a clip of me reenacting the classic Here's Johnny scene from the Kubrick movie somewhere amidst the series, and I'm still deciding how to pull that one off without destroying a perfectly good door. I like my doors. They're good doors. They've never hurt anyone, you know? Anyway, history and background. This film is a horror classic, but this movie has quite a history that extends beyond what actually made it on screen. There have been numerous YouTube videos made about the movie's endless conspiracy theories and behind-the-scenes issues, so I won't get too carried away in that department. I suggest you check out a video from the channel New Rock Stars entitled The Shining Breakdown and Analysis if you wish to fall down that particular rabbit hole. The link is in the linky place down yonder, so check it out when you finish up this video. Stanley Kubrick is one of the most celebrated directors in the history of filmmaking. His filmography includes the groundbreaking 2001 A Space Odyssey, the controversial cult classic A Clockwork Orange, the dark homage to the war in Vietnam Full Metal Jacket, and the Tom Cruise-infused sex fest Eyes Wide Shut. Immediately prior to making The Shining, Kubrick had directed a film entitled Barry Lyndon, and it was met with yawns by critics and moviegoers alike. I've watched a few clips from the film to see what was so underwhelming about it, and yeah, Barry Lyndon looks about as exciting as watching dog turds harden in the snow. Determined to return to the big screen with a vengeance, Kubrick reportedly began reading book after book in search of the story that would give him the source material he needed with which to craft a screenplay that would allow for critical acclaim without sacrificing artistic fulfillment. Eventually, he came across King's novel, and Kubrick was enthralled. He felt he had found the basis for the comeback he desperately needed. However, the critics, King among them, were not so sure. It's hard to believe that this film, which would go on to become one of the horror genre's all-time greats, was initially met with some harsh criticism. A few choice quotes from its early reviews make that clear. From Variety, quote, "With everything to work with, Kubrick has teamed with jumpy Jack Nicholson to destroy all that was so terrifying about Stephen King's bestseller," unquote. Ouch. Another from Gene Siskel, in which he gave the film 2 out of 4 stars, reads, quote, "A crashing disappointment. The biggest surprise is that it contains virtually no thrills. Given Kubrick's world-class reputation, one's immediate reaction is that maybe he was after something other than thrills in the film. If so, it's hard to figure out what," unquote. Yeesh. And one final quote from Vincent Missiano's review in Aries magazine reads, quote, "The Shining lays open to view all the devices of horror and suspense, endless eerie music, odd camera angles, a soundtrack of interminably pounding heart, interminably pounding heart, hatchets, and hunts. The result is shallow, self-conscious, and dull. Read the book," unquote. Oof. For reasons we will discuss in the next segment, it's safe to say King himself was delighted by these reviews. It wasn't until years later that there was a critical re-evaluation of the film, and it seems that the general consensus of critics and moviegoers alike was that The Shining was in fact a masterpiece. Roger Ebert, for instance, was initially critical of the work, but would go on to say, quote, "Stanley Kubrick's cold and frightening The Shining challenges us to decide who is the reliable observer, whose idea of events can we trust. It is this elusive open-endedness that makes Kubrick's film so strangely disturbing," unquote. Additionally, horror film critic Peter Brack wrote in High Def Digest, son of a bee sting, quote, "The Shining has somehow risen from the ashes of its own bad press to redefine itself not only as a seminal work of the genre, but perhaps the most stately, artful horror ever made," unquote. It's hard to say what caused this widespread shift in opinion, but it seems that perhaps because the critics didn't initially get what they were expecting, a traditional horror film as opposed to the unconventional slow burn psychological thriller that Kubrick presented them with, their initial reactions were based on the film's inability to meet their expectations rather than being based on the film itself. Is it by the book? In a lot of ways, the film is true to the novel. However, King has been notoriously and very publicly critical of Kubrick's adaptation. In fact, he's been quoted as saying that the adaptation of The Shining was the only film adaptation of his work that he could remember hating. I'll have to assume that this quote was made in advance of the release of the numerous subsequent terrible King adaptations, some of which King himself was partially responsible for. King felt that the topics of disintegration of the family and of alcoholism should have been more present in the film. He did not approve of Jack Nicholson being cast in the role of Jack Torrance and was also dissatisfied by Shelley Duvall's portrayal of Wendy Torrance. We will discuss the reasons why King felt this way in a later segment. The general idea of the novel, Jack Torrance and his family find themselves trapped in the Overlook and bad things happen, remains intact. However, for King, Kubrick's version strayed too far from the novel in specific ways that were not to his taste. He is quoted as saying in 2008 on thewordslinger.com, quote, "Parts of the film are chilling, charged with a relentlessly claustrophobic terror, but others fall flat. Not that religion has to be involved in horror, but a visceral skeptic, such as Kubrick just couldn't grasp the sheer inhuman evil of the Overlook Hotel, so he looked instead for evil in the characters and made the film into a domestic tragedy with only vaguely supernatural overtones. That was the basic flaw. Because he couldn't believe, he couldn't make the film believable to others. What's basically wrong with Kubrick's version of The Shining is that it's a film by a man who thinks too much and feels too little, and that's why, for all its virtuoso effects, it never gets you by the throat and hangs on the way real horror should," unquote. Essentially, in the novel, it is the Overlook and its influences that are the villain, but in the film, the viewer gets the impression, at least in King's mind, that it is Jack himself that is the source of evil, and that the Overlook is merely an amplifier of Jack's malevolence. Now, from reading the book, we know that Jack has had his struggles and that he is capable of hurting others, including his own son. But in the book, we also have a chance to see him make a solid effort to redeem himself and to be a better man. This inner struggle is missing from the film, and for that reason, King feels the character of Jack from the movie lacks these redeeming qualities, and rather than his slow descent into madness, he instead comes off as an unlikable, semi-psychotic asshole from the start. Honestly, there are so many differences from the book that it would take way too long to cover them all, so check the Wikipedia link in the description if you want to comb through them. Soundtrack and score. As someone who is typically not a fan of 80s synth soundtracks, I do appreciate this film's music choices, and to be sure, that style does not make up the entirety of this film's soundtrack. The opening and, in my opinion, most memorable piece from the film features a warbling, slightly detuned horn emulator that feels like the funeral dirge with its plodding, single-note passages. It sets the tone, and its stark, bare-bones approach is unconventional yet effective. There are, however, various pieces throughout the film which feature live instrumentation that is full of nightmarish, shrieking violins, discordant swells of inharmonious noise, and music that is straight up out of a hallucinogenic-induced fever dream. It wasn't until I listened to the soundtrack on its own without the film in the foreground that I was able to appreciate how truly diabolical it is. Cast and acting. Jack Nicholson's portrayal of Jack Torrance is easily his most iconic performance. Nicholson has the ability to be menacing without even trying, and when he goes full crazy, he is genuinely terrifying. While the Jack Torrance of the film is not portrayed as the same character from the book in a lot of ways, Nicholson was just right for Kubrick's version of the story. King was not in favor of the casting choice, as I mentioned earlier, and felt that Nicholson was too unhinged from the start. Other actors who had been considered for the role include Robert De Niro, Robin Williams, and Harrison Ford, all of whom King also objected to. Can you imagine if Robin Williams had been cast as Jack Torrance? Now, that's something I would have loved to see. Let's use the wonders of face swap technology to just get a little taste of what that might have looked like.
I think you have some very definite ideas about what should be done with Danny.
Maybe he should be taken to a doctor.
Maybe he should be taken to a doctor.
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible.
Jack!
Oh. Okay, so that doesn't look like Robin Williams at all. Somebody deepfake this sucker for me, please. Shelley Duvall was cast to play Wendy Torrance, and King did not approve of this decision either. He has gone on record to state that the portrayal of Wendy Torrance in the film was misogynistic and, quote, "She's basically just there to scream and be stupid, and that's not the woman I wrote about," unquote. He has also compared the character to a screaming dish rag. Not that all of the blame for this can be laid at Duvall's feet. She was following the demands of her director, of course, and it is no secret that Kubrick pushed Duvall beyond her breaking point on more than one occasion during filming, to the point that her hair was falling out. For more info on this, I've linked an article in the description that covers Kubrick's arguably abusive treatment of Duvall. In addition to King's criticism and Kubrick's harassment, as if to add insult to injury, Duvall was nominated for a Razzie Award for Worst Actress for her role in the film. Personally, I don't hate her performance, and I have a hard time imagining anyone else in the role, although, like King, I would have enjoyed seeing her portrayed more in line with that of the character from the novel. Danny Lloyd, the child who played Danny Torrance, gives a decent performance for a kid his age. There are parts of his performance I find myself chuckling at, in spite of myself, but he's fine. Personally, I would have cast a slightly older kid, or at least one that seemed a bit more intuitive or bright for his age. But again, I'm finding myself comparing the movie portrayal to that of the book, but on its own, in the context of the film, Danny Lloyd does fine. Scatman Crothers crushes it in the role of Dick Halloran. He's a great actor, and Crothers does him justice. I have no criticism to offer. Special effects and cinematography. This film has some of the most memorable shots of all time. Danny riding his trike through the halls of the Overlook, the tsunami of blood pouring from the elevator, even the footage shot from a helicopter during the opening credits. Kubrick was known for his unconventional technique, and The Shining is no exception. Every shot, every frame of this film is so deliberate, and Kubrick himself was literally hands-on in capturing many of the movie's shots. It is fairly remarkable that Kubrick manages to avoid virtually every 80s horror film trope and deliver a film that has visually stood the test of time, an accomplishment that very few films of that era, and 80s horror films in particular, can boast. Final thoughts. If you haven't seen this film, which, I'm assuming everyone has seen this film at this point, but if you haven't, you should watch it. It's a good one. It's a classic for a reason. despite King's criticism, despite it straying from the path of the novel, it's a really cool movie with a lot of amazing shots. And also, I forgot to mention earlier on that it was shot in chronological order, which posed a lot of problems, but also I think was really, it's just pretty cool. It's cool. Watch the movie. Room 237. Documentary? So I was under the impression that this was a documentary about the making of Kubrick's film. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Room 237 is not in fact a documentary, rather it is a conspiracy theorist's wet dream full of far-fetched suppositions and interpretations of the film that range from the plausible to the flat-out ridiculous. Theories range from the film being based on Native American genocide or vaguely symbolic of the Holocaust, to the claim that an image of Kubrick himself appears airbrushed into the clouds of the opening scene. They literally show the clouds and walk you through it frame by frame, but don't make any effort to actually point out where Cloud Kubrick is hiding. Spoiler alert, he isn't there. I looked and he just isn't there. And it gets worse. One lady mentions the window in Ullman, the manager of the Overlook's office, and says, quote, "There is something wrong with this window, it just doesn't belong here," unquote, and then offers nothing to support this thought. Good God, these people are grasping at straws from the very start, and it just devolves further and further into absurdity. On top of the super outlandish theories, the film itself consists almost entirely of late 70s stock footage, slowed down clips of Kubrick's film being played over and over again, and clips from other Kubrick films. We never actually see the people who are narrating this nonsense, but these people all sound completely bonkers. I'm all for finding the hidden meanings and the subliminal messages in films, but these folks are digging deep on some of these theories, and there are so many. These lunatics even think the moon landing was faked and possibly filmed by Kubrick. This film is nearly 2 hours long, and I made it about 30 minutes in before I nearly tapped out. I did keep going, though, out of determination, and hoped that eventually this would be worth watching. To my disappointment, the only good thing about this documentary is that I left feeling very sane. Final thoughts. Don't watch this show. Room 237 is a mishmash of wild conspiracy theories and long-shot metaphorical bullshit by people so obsessed with this film that they allowed themselves to analyze and overanalyze every single moment of it. It's kind of sad, honestly. Apparently the movie was so good, it ruined their lives. Alright, that's enough of that. Check out the next video in this series that covers the Stephen King approved 2003 made-for-TV miniseries, which he himself wrote the teleplay for. I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard things about it, and also I've learned not to allow myself to have high expectations, even when the King himself is directly involved. But hey, maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty please with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.